The wrestling world is in mourning. A silence has fallen over locker rooms across the globe, a silence that says more than words ever could. Hulk Hogan, the man who transcended wrestling and became a larger-than-life symbol of the 1980s, of American grit, of entertainment glory, has died. At 71, Terry Jean Bollea succumbed to cardiac arrest in the early hours of Thursday morning, leaving behind not just a legacy, but an entire era. And while millions grieve, one man, perhaps more than any other, feels the weight of that loss in his bones. Ric Flair, the nature boy, the Rolex-wearing, limousine-riding Steelin and profilin icon of wrestling excess, received the call before the news hit TMZ. Before Twitter exploded. Before WWE released its official statement. In that quiet space, between the phone vibrating on his nightstand and the voice on the other end confirming what he already feared, Ric Flair sat still. The man known for his flamboyance and bombastic promos didn't say a word. He couldn't. Because this wasn't just the death of a friend. It wasn't just the loss of a colleague, a rival, or even a peer. This was the final curtain call for the man who helped shape Ric Flair's legend, and whose own legacy is forever intertwined with his. Flair and Hogan were never just two superstars on a wrestling card. They were titans. Icons in a mythology WWE wrote across 4 decades. And while their personas often clashed, Hogan, the red and yellow American hero, and Flair, the strutting, arrogant villain, they were, in many ways, mirror images. Each relied on charisma, each embodied the cultural moment of their prime, and each knew how to command an arena with just a look, a pause, or the drop of a signature whoa. But now, one of them is gone. As tributes rolled in from around the world, it was Ric Flair's voice that cracked the loudest. His first statement, shared on X, formerly Twitter, read simply, "I've lost my brother. The ring will never feel the same again. I love you, Hulk." But it wasn't enough. Those words were raw, but they barely scratched the surface of decades of shared history, wars fought in the ring, cities traveled, locker room laughter, and quiet, backstage moments the cameras never caught. So Flair took to Instagram Live later that night. And what followed wasn't a performance. It wasn't a promo. It was a confession. A man, now in the twilight of his own life, mourning someone who'd been both his rival and his constant, with tears in his eyes, Ric Flair looked into the camera and whispered, "I don't even know how to do this without him." This wasn't just emotion. It was devastation. Flair spoke about their first meeting back in the late 70s, before either man had reached the stratosphere. He recalled the first time they main event opposite each other in front of a sold-out crowd in Chicago, the roar of the fans vibrating through the concrete backstage halls. He talked about Hogan's laugh, loud, unmistakable, contagious. And he talked about the man behind the mustache. The man who called to check on him during Flair's multiple hospitalizations. The man who sent flowers when his son Reed passed away. The man who, despite being built like a superhero, was just Terry to those who truly knew him. The rivalry between Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan defined generations. WWE's marketing machine often framed them as opposites: Hogan, the smiling face of Americana; Flair, the villainous embodiment of arrogance and indulgence. But that binary was never the full story. Behind the scenes, they were two men who understood each other in a way no one else could. They lived the same grind. The same highs. The same brutal cost of fame. They were kings in a business that chews through royalty. Flair spoke about that too. He spoke of how lonely it could be at the top, and how only someone like Hogan truly understood what it meant to carry a company on your back. "We both bled for this business," he said, choking back tears. "We gave it everything. We were on the road 300 days a year. We missed birthdays. We missed anniversaries. We missed life." But Hogan, Flair said, never complained. He'd walk into a locker room, and no matter how banged up he was, no matter how tired, he'd throw that smile on, point to a kid in the front row, and boom, Hulkamania was alive. Every night. What made Hogan different, Flair explained, wasn't just the physique, or the promos, or the leg drop that sealed countless victories. It was his heart. the way he treated people. The way he made you feel like you mattered, even if you were a rookie carrying his bags or a kid watching from the cheap seats. In a world of egos, Hogan had every reason to be one. He was the most recognizable face in wrestling for nearly 2 decades. Movies, merchandise, cereal boxes, Saturday morning cartoons, Hogan wasn't just a wrestler. He was a symbol. A household name. But, Flair recalled, he never made you feel small. He never pulled rank. He wanted everyone to shine. That humility, Flair said, was what people didn't always see. They saw the posing, the flexing, the red and yellow. They saw the Hulkster, not the man. But Ric Flair saw him. He saw Terry. The grief in Flair's voice shifted to anger at one point, not at Hogan, but at the unrelenting march of time. "We're losing them," he said. "One by one. Dusty's gone. Piper's gone. Warrior. Savage. And now Hulk." His voice cracked. "I'm tired of saying goodbye to my brothers." He paused, wiping his face with a towel. Then, barely above a whisper, "I should have told him I loved him more." The wrestling community, for all its theatrics, is built on bonds forged in steel cages and 15-hour travel days. There is no fraternity quite like it. And among that brotherhood, few bonds ran deeper than Hogan and Flair's. They competed in different promotions. They drew different crowds. But their legacies were parallel, and now one of those legacies must continue alone. Backstage at WWE SmackDown, the atmosphere was muted. Young superstars, some who had never met Hogan but had grown up idolizing him, walked through the halls with their heads down. The veterans stood in clusters, arms folded, trading memories in quiet voices. Ric Flair, who had not appeared on TV in months, was quietly flown in by WWE. He didn't ask for airtime. He didn't want to cut a tribute promo. He just wanted to be there, to feel the ring one more time in Hogan's absence. Before the show went live, WWE held a moment of silence. The Titantron flickered to life with black and white images of Hulk Hogan through the years, WrestleMania 3, body slamming Andre the Giant. The red and yellow entrance. The finger point. The ear cup. The "whatcha gonna do?" And then, the screen faded to black, replaced by 4 words, "Thank you, Hulk Hogan." The crowd, silent at first, erupted. Not with cheers, but with applause. The kind of applause reserved for legends. For icons. For one of the greatest to ever step foot in the squared circle, Flair stood backstage, watching from the monitor, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. No tears this time. Just reverence. Just heartbreak. He turned to a crew member and whispered, "He'd have loved that." Then he walked away. Later that night, Ric Flair did something he rarely does, he went out into the ring unannounced. There was no music. No entrance video. Just the sound of his boots on canvas and a microphone in his hand. The crowd didn't cheer right away. They waited. They sensed something sacred was about to happen. Flair stood in the center of the ring, took a deep breath, and looked around the arena. "I don't have a script," he said. "I don't have a promo. I just have memories." He spoke for nearly 15 minutes. About WrestleMania. About backstage ribs. About the way Hogan used to pep talk younger talent before their matches. He told the story of how, after a particularly grueling match in 1994, Hogan carried him on his back to the locker room because Flair's knees had locked up. He was Superman, Flair said. But even Superman needs someone to tell him he was loved. I hope he knew. When he finished, the crowd gave him a standing ovation, not just for his words, but for what they represented. A living legend mourning another. A man grappling with the loss of someone who had been a pillar in his life. Ric Flair raised his eyes to the rafters, whispered "Woo" one last time, and left the ring. Outside the arena, flowers and candles had already started piling up. Fans in vintage Hulkamania shirts stood shoulder to shoulder with children in replica belts. Someone played Hogan's theme song on a Bluetooth speaker. Someone else held a sign that read, "Heroes never die, they just tag out." And somewhere, in the quiet hours of the early morning, Ric Flair sat alone in his hotel room. No cameras. No crowd. Just memories. The Nature Boy had lived 1,000 lifetimes inside a wrestling ring, but this night, none of it mattered. What mattered was the absence of a man who'd once stood beside him as the face of a golden age. What mattered was the silence in his phone. The realization that no new stories would be made. Only old ones retold. As dawn crept in through the curtains, Ric Flair looked out over the city and whispered the words he'd carried in his heart all night, "I'll see you on the other side, brother. Rest easy." The following morning, Ric Flair didn't check the headlines. He didn't open his phone to scroll through the avalanche of tributes, editorials, or reaction videos pouring in across social media. He already knew what they would say. That Hulk Hogan was a legend. That he changed the industry. That he was the first to bring professional wrestling into the mainstream spotlight, standing shoulder to shoulder with icons of music, movies, and sports. But what they wouldn't capture, what they could never capture, was what it felt like to live that era beside him. Flair knew the Hogan that few had seen. The man who sat with him in hotel lobbies until sunrise talking about their kids, their injuries, the politics of the business. The man who pulled him aside during one of his lowest moments, when the spotlight had dimmed and the roar of the crowd had faded, and said, "You're not done, brother. You've got more in you." Rick never forgot that moment. And now, with Hogan gone, he felt a part of himself had gone too. In a private conversation with WWE staff later that day, Flair was overheard saying, "I feel like we were the last of something. And now, it's just me." The weight of that truth settled heavily on his shoulders. Wrestlers like them weren't made anymore. Not because the talent had disappeared, there were countless stars lighting up modern arenas, but because the world had changed. The territories were gone. The culture was different. The grind, the lifestyle, the way Hogan and Flair used to live and breathe this business, it belonged to another time, and now, that time had ended. Inside WWE's headquarters, plans were already in motion for a tribute show. Vince McMahon, now semi-retired but still wielding influence, reportedly made a late-night call to ensure the production honored Hogan not as a gimmick, but as the man who made this company what it is. Paul Levesque, Triple H, immediately reached out to Ric Flair and asked if he'd consider opening the tribute. Not with fanfare, not with catchphrases, but with heart. Flair didn't hesitate. "If I can hold it together, I'll do it." The next week on Raw, WWE dimmed the lights. Every screen in the arena showed Hogan's smiling face. His iconic bandana. That unmistakable handlebar mustache. The theme "Real American" didn't play. Not yet. Instead, a slow instrumental version filled the air as the camera panned across superstars and staff standing silently on stage. Roman Reigns stood with his arms crossed. Seth Rollins bowed his head. Becky Lynch wiped away a tear. And in the center of the ring, Ric Flair stood with a microphone and a heart heavy enough to sink the building. He took a breath. The crowd was silent. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice already trembling. "Because the man I'm here to honor was larger than life." "And how do you sum up a life like that in a few minutes?" He paused, closing his eyes. "I've shared the ring with him. I've fought him. I've traveled the world with him. We've argued. We've laughed. We've toasted championships. We've mourned losses. And through it all, through all the years, all the miles, he never stopped being the man. The guy. The one you looked at and said, 'That's the standard.'" Flair's voice cracked. "He called me brother. And I called him one too." The arena watched in reverent stillness. Even the production crew held their breath. There was no one like him. Not before. Not since. There was only Hulk Hogan. And now, this ring, it feels emptier than it ever has before. Then, as if pulled by a force he couldn't resist, Flair turned toward the entrance ramp. And slowly, deliberately, he spread his arms wide and let out a soft, tear-filled whoa. The arena erupted. Not in chaos, but in cathartic release. Fans clapped, many cried. And then the first chords of Real American rang out. The Titantron played Hogan's most iconic moments. Body slams. Promos. The tearing of the shirt. The finger-pointing comeback. The leg drop. The crowd chanted, "Hogan! Hogan!" over and over again. Flair stood in the center of it all, just a man surrounded by memories. Backstage, when he stepped through the curtain, a swarm of superstars stood waiting. No cameras. No scripts. Just respect. They clapped for him, not for the performance, but for carrying the weight of their grief on live television. Triple H hugged him tightly. Shawn Michaels whispered, "You did him proud." But Flair's eyes were distant. "It's still not enough," he murmured. Later that night, Ric returned to his hotel alone. The suite was nice, WWE had insisted. But it was too quiet. Too big. He took off his shoes, his coat, and sat at the edge of the bed. On the nightstand sat a framed photo someone from WWE had left there. It was a black and white image of Flair and Hogan backstage in 1991, laughing, mid-conversation, in the middle of tying their boots. Two gladiators not yet weathered by age. Two legends before they knew they'd become legends. Ric picked up the photo and traced the edge of it with his thumb. "I miss you, man," he said quietly. For the next hour, he poured himself a single glass of whiskey and sat in silence. No music. No television. Just the hum of the air conditioner and the flicker of passing headlights outside the window. He thought about the matches. The hotels. The ribs. The weight cuts. The broken bones. The constant roar of the crowd, and the moment the curtain fell. He thought about Hogan's kids, and how proud the man was of them. He remembered the first time Hulk met Reed, Ric's late son. How Hogan crouched down and told the boy, "You've got a champion's heart, kid. Just like your dad." Ric could barely breathe. He knew, deep down, that there was no eulogy, no promo, no video montage that could ever capture what Hulk Hogan meant to him, not just as a wrestler, but as a man, as a brother, as a constant in a world that was always moving too fast. The next morning, Ric Flair visited the WWE Performance Center in Orlando. Not to film, not to talk, but to listen. He sat on a bench in the corner of the training ring and watched the new generation of wrestlers practice their footwork. They were good. Hungry. Talented. But Flair wasn't watching their technique. He was watching their eyes. Searching for that spark, that intangible, that fire, that Hogan had. One of the young wrestlers approached him shyly. "Mr. Flair," he said, "I just want you to know, Hulk Hogan is why I got into this." Ric looked at him for a long time, then nodded. "Me too," he whispered. Then, standing slowly, his body older now, but his spirit as defiant as ever, Ric Flair put his hand on the young man's shoulder. "Keep his name alive," he said. "Not just in the ring. In the way you carry yourself. In the way you treat people. That's what made him great. Not the leg drop. The man." Outside the Performance Center, as Flair walked toward the car waiting to take him to the airport, he turned one last time to glance back at the building. The Florida sun was just rising, bathing the parking lot in golden light. He didn't cry this time. Instead, he smiled. "I'll see you again, brother," he said softly. Then he turned and walked into the morning. In the days that followed, Ric Flair's tribute rippled far beyond the wrestling world. ESPN aired a special segment called Icons of the Ring, dedicating an entire hour to Hulk Hogan's career, but it was Ric Flair's interview, raw, unscripted, visibly shaken, that became the emotional centerpiece. Sitting in a dark studio, only a spotlight illuminating his face, Flair repeated what he had told the crowd at Raw. But this time, there was no audience to respond, no chance of Hogan. "Just quiet. I never thought I'd outlive him," Flair said. "He was always the stronger one. Bigger, tougher. He could still bench press a truck in his 60s. I thought if anyone was going to go first, it'd be me." He chuckled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. There's a thing they don't tell you about wrestling, he said. It's not the matches that break you. Not the bumps. It's the people you lose along the way. And now I've lost Dusty, I've lost Roddy, I've lost Savage. And now I've lost Hulk. The interviewer stayed silent. Let Flair lead. And he did. You know what I regret? He continued. I regret that we didn't tag more. That we didn't sit down and film a real documentary. Not the kayfabe stuff. I mean us. The men behind the characters. Me and him just sitting, telling stories. Because there's so much people don't know. The stories did come out, eventually. Fans shared old footage of Flair and Hogan wrestling at Madison Square Garden in the early 90s. Clips from WCW Monday Nitro flooded YouTube, battles that once divided fans, now preserved as sacred memories. One video surfaced of the two backstage before a match, Hogan giving Flair a big bear hug and saying, "Let's go steal the show one more time, brother." Flair had posted that same clip to his Instagram with the caption, "Every time we stepped out there, it was magic." But grief has a strange way of catching you off guard. One night, Flair was backstage at a live event. He had agreed to make a quick appearance to introduce the next Hall of Fame inductee. But as he stood behind the curtain, waiting for his cue, the familiar strains of Real American played, not for Hogan, of course, but as part of a tribute montage WWE had prepared to air on the Jumbotron. Flair froze. He wasn't supposed to be on during this part, but hearing that music, the slow build, the electric guitar, the triumphant rhythm that had once heralded Hulkamania, shattered him. He turned away, his hand covering his mouth, and quietly walked back to the dressing room. He sat down on a folding chair, head in his hands, and didn't come out for the rest of the night. He couldn't. That music wasn't just a theme. It was a time machine. A reminder of everything they had built together, and everything that was now gone. WWE executives, sensitive to the grief, gave Flair time. There were whispers that they were planning a statue for Hogan, perhaps at WrestleMania 41, where they would officially honor him in front of the world. Flair, they said, would be the one to unveil it, but Ric had an idea of his own. He requested to visit Hogan's childhood home in Augusta, Georgia. A quiet neighborhood, not far from the coast, where Hogan had once ridden his bike down the street barefoot and dreamed of being a superhero. Flair brought no cameras. No entourage. Just himself and a driver. When he arrived, the house looked much the same, at least from the outside. The current owners, aware of Flair's request and Hogan's passing, welcomed him in. He didn't stay long. Just wandered through the front hall, paused at the living room fireplace, and then stepped out into the backyard. There, he looked up at the sky. He used to tell me, Flair later shared, that he'd lie on the grass out here, stare at the clouds, and imagine what it would be like to main event Madison Square Garden. He smiled through the pain. And damn if he didn't do it. On the return trip, Flair told the driver to take the long way home. He wanted to think. To remember. He rolled down the window and let the Georgia breeze hit his face. It smelled like summer and memories. Do you think he knew? Flair asked suddenly. The driver, confused, looked in the rearview mirror. Knew what, sir? How much I loved him. How much we all did. The driver didn't answer. He didn't need to. The wrestling world continued to pay its respects. A special on Peacock titled Hulkamania, The Legacy of a Legend aired the following week. Ric Flair narrated portions of it, including a letter he had written personally to Hogan, which he read aloud in a studio filled with candlelight and silence. Dear Hulk, the letter began. You were more than a rival. More than a friend. You were the heartbeat of our generation. You were the banner we all marched behind. And though we stood on opposite sides of the ring, we were always fighting for the same thing, to give the fans magic. To remind them, even just for a moment, that anything was possible. As Flair read, his voice wavered but never broke. You taught me how to be larger than life. How to lean into the moment. How to shake every hand and look every kid in the eye. You made wrestling feel like the center of the universe. And for a long time it was. He took a breath, but most of all, you reminded me that behind the lights, behind the promos, behind the muscles and the madness, there was always a man. A man named Terry. And I miss him. Every day. By the time the letter ended, the screen faded to black. Just one word remained on the screen, immortal, because Hulk Hogan was never just a man. He was an era. A force. A dream cast in red and yellow, larger than life yet deeply human in his final chapter. And Ric Flair, arguably the only other man who walked the same impossible tightrope of fame, pain, and legacy, was now the lone survivor of that golden age. In his final post of the week, Flair wrote simply, "If you ever cheered for us, if you ever wore the shirt, if you ever believed in the magic, thank you. You kept us alive." And somewhere, perhaps in that place beyond the curtain, beyond the ropes, beyond the pain and the kayfabe, Hogan smiled. The announcement came 2 weeks later, official, dignified, and yet emotionally seismic. WrestleMania 41 would open with a memorial ceremony dedicated to Hulk Hogan. The news hit like a tidal wave. Fans around the world began making travel plans not just to witness the grandest stage of them all, but to say goodbye to the immortal one. The arena in Las Vegas was sold out months in advance, but now every seat held new weight. This wasn't just a wrestling show anymore. It was a requiem. A celebration. A final bow for the man who made WrestleMania what it is. Who gave wrestling its first taste of mainstream immortality. Backstage, the WWE locker room was unlike anything it had been in years. Superstars, many of whom weren't even born during Hulkamania's peak, walked around with their heads lowered and their voices softened. The company had issued commemorative armbands, each one emblazoned with Hogan's signature lightning bolt and the words "Forever Immortal." Ric Flair arrived early. He wore a black suit and a red pocket square, a subtle nod to the signature colors of his fallen friend. The nature of grief had settled into his bones now, not the sharp, unbearable kind, but the lingering ache that reminded him, moment by moment, that something was gone forever. And tonight, in front of the world, he would give Hulk Hogan one last spotlight. One last woo. As showtime approached, the crowd buzzed in anticipation. But this was not the usual roar of excitement. It was reverent. It was sacred. And when the lights dimmed and the Titantron flickered to life, an eerie hush blanketed the stadium. The screen faded in from black to white. A slow montage began. Grainy footage from the 80s. Hogan in his early days. Slamming Andre. Pointing into the crowd. Ripping his shirt. Holding the WWE Championship high above his head. The music swelled, a soft orchestral rendition of Real American. The crowd, unable to hold back, stood to their feet. Some clapped. Some cried. Some simply watched, frozen in awe. Then, the screen faded again. A single quote appeared: "To be immortal is not to never die. It's to be remembered forever." And with that, Ric Flair's voice echoed through the stadium. He walked slowly down the ramp, microphone in hand, no entrance music, no pyro. Just the weight of memory. He entered the ring, alone, under a single spotlight. "Las Vegas," he began, his voice echoing, "I stand before you not as the Nature Boy. Not as a 16-time world champion. But as a man who lost his brother." The audience stayed silent. "I've lived a wild life. You all know that. But if there was one constant through every plane ride, every arena, every sold-out show, it was Terry Bollea. It was Hulk Hogan." Flair paused. His lips trembled. "You didn't just watch him. You felt him. When that music hit, when he cupped his hand to his ear, when he dropped that leg, man, you believed. You believed that good could beat evil. That hero still existed." The crowd slowly began to applaud. Flair looked up at the rafters. "People ask me all the time, who was the greatest? Flair or Hogan? And I tell them, it's not a contest. Because Hogan didn't just change wrestling. He created what it became. He opened the door for all of us. Every superstar you cheer for today, they're walking through the house Hogan built." He took a deep breath. "And tonight, we open WrestleMania in his honor. Because without him, without Hulkamania, there is no WrestleMania. A chant broke out in the upper decks. Slowly, it spread like wildfire. Thank you, Hogan. Clap 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 clap, thank you, Hogan. Flair wiped a tear from his cheek. He once told me, Flair said, that as long as people remember, you never really die. Well, look around, brother, we remember. We always will. Then, raising his head, Ric Flair delivered one final, thunderous whoa that shook the stadium and gave way to a sea of applause. As he stepped out of the ring, the lights dimmed again. This time, the Titantron displayed a